I'm a Jewish woman with an intact son who's in his 20s. It was a very difficult decision at the time, but I was teaching parents to massage their babies, and when I learned about that, I couldn't allow that for my son. When I started my advocacy, it seemed that Jews, because they've been doing this for thousands of years, that it's harder. They don't often want to engage in this conversation.
For many years, when Jewish friends and acquaintances from my synagogue would find out that I'd penned articles questioning Jewish circumcision, or more recently when they'd learned that I'm the author of The Measure of His Grief, the first novel ever written about circumcision, they'd quickly understand that I'm not neutral on this issue, that I think the Jewish people should stop circumcising. Here's what would sometimes happen. Oh, pause. But circumcision is so much healthier. It's the sign of the covenant, too. Plus, it's more hygienic, it prevents disease. Don't you know that AIDS rates in Africa have gone down dramatically because of it? Oh, but the procedure is so much worse when the person is an adult. Much less traumatic to get it done in infancy, much more humane. Nothing like what's done to women in Africa. Now that's barbaric. I'd smile and stay calm and explain that there's absolutely no reason for radical surgery on healthy tissue except as a last resort. Or I'd state the erogenous nature of foreskin tissue in the most matter-of-fact tone conceivable. Sadly, none of it would ever seem to change anyone's mind.
The notion that Judaism is a religion and a culture that cannot change, that doesn't correspond to what we as anthropologists know about cultures. Cultures change. They change constantly in response to individual decision-making, to individual will. If we look at any culture anywhere, we see that although basic patterns may remain, all sorts of individual parts of the cultures change.
Well, there's plenty of practicing Jews who don't circumcise. They haven't circumcised their son. They gave that up. In one way of looking at it, you're saying you're giving it up like you're giving up keeping kosher. You know, that's kind of on its way out. There's lots of practicing Jews who don't keep kosher. There's services and so forth, getting whittled down to just high holidays. But people still consider themselves practicing Jews. But in America, they're hanging on to circumcision. That's an important part of Judaism. Now, scripturally, it is an important part of Judaism. But we're just going to have to get beyond it. Those texts written 5,000 years ago were written at a time when children and wives were chattel. They belonged to the father and husband, and you could abuse them and in many cases kill them with impunity. And that is just not the case anymore. So we can't do that anymore, and Judaism is just going to have to get over it.
Ultimately, Judaism will also do away with circumcision, just as they've done away with slavery and stoning adulterous women to death and many of the other practices that were considered pro forma in the biblical era, but now we know are wrong.
Learning about the harm of circumcision can motivate adults to protect children from this harm. In my preliminary interviews with rabbis, they agreed that the welfare of the child is the primary consideration. This suggests that raising awareness about the harm of circumcision could be persuasive to Jews.
If tomorrow, or if over the next 3 years, a large body of scientific evidence were to be established that circumcision was actually detrimental in a lot of ways to the male infant and to a man, would you sort of say, okay, that's it?
We would look at that very seriously. We would look at that very seriously. If a large body of information came about scientifically that said, you know what, we were wrong, let me tell you, when it comes to something that we find is detrimental, whether it was something that we shouldn't have done that we should, or something we should have done that we shouldn't, 100%. Because pikuach nefesh and saving lives and quality of lives is our number one concern. Parents have the obligation, not just the option, the obligation to protect their children.
My inquiry into Brit Milah has convinced me that every one of my concerns about the right is rooted not just in my own personal worldview, but in Judaism itself. Let's go back to the concerns I mentioned, starting with pain. According to Jewish law, it is forbidden to cause tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, or pain of living things. Even the necessary causing of pain is considered cruel in Judaism. And Jewish law even prohibits the pairing up of a small and a large animal for plowing in case the asymmetry causes the littler one discomfort. Clearly, concern over the pain of others has strong Judaic roots. What about the concern that circumcision involves the surgical alteration of a perfectly natural, God-given part of the body? This concern, too, stems from Jewish thought. We Westerners generally find the bodily mutilation practiced in other cultures to be deeply distasteful. This distaste is based on the Hebrew Bible's denouncement of pagan practices such as tattooing and cutting the flesh. Then there's the risk of serious complications and even death from circumcision. No matter how small these risks are, they must be considered. Now, even this concern is an echo of Jewish law. Judaism regards life as infinitely sacred and gives it precedence over all else. Accordingly, Jewish law tells us that any medical procedure involving even the possibility of risk to life must be viewed as dangerous and is therefore strictly forbidden. Thus, the risk of circumcision is not just a medical concern, but a Jewish one. My concern that many see Brit Milah as a perfunctory act rather than a spiritual one is also a Jewish concern. This is a thorny point of Jewish law, but I will try to summarize the issues for you. Judaism stresses deeds more than faith. So, according to Jewish law, one should perform the commandments, of which circumcision is one, even if the act does not reflect one's spiritual beliefs. And yet, there is also a Jewish law requiring that we perform every commandment with our whole heart, with spiritual intent or kavanah. So, although Jewish law supports circumcision even when it is done without a broader commitment to Judaism or God, there is also Jewish reason to find it unsettling when this happens. I also mentioned my concern that circumcision requires parents to take advantage of their infant's helplessness. Even this concept, that we have a moral obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves, is, you guessed it, a Jewish concept. Additionally, the idea of treating others as you yourself would like to be treated is a Jewish one. According to Jewish lore, the legendary Rabbi Hillel was once asked to summarize Judaism while standing on one leg. Hillel replied, "What is hateful to you, do not to your fellow creature."
This is my son. And this is a life that I cherish, and I'm not even going to cut him for God.
So what do you think God's response would have been to that?
I think that God would have said, "Good, you passed the test."
I agree with you.
My husband and I were both Jewish, and of course it means that our son will be Jewish too. It's not something you can take away from him. I don't think you can force a newborn to go through an irreversible, medical, unnecessary procedure. It's a religious commandment, and there are 612 others which we do not keep, so there's no reason for us to be cherry-picking this exact one. You can't force a medical procedure on a newborn and call it tradition.
Ich habe selber Kinder, 3 Kinder, 3 in Deutschland. Und ich habe sie natürlich nicht beschnitten, also es ist sogar nicht mal in Frage gekommen, also das war ganz klar. Und für mich dieses Engagement gegen die Zwangsbeschneidung ist ein Teil meiner Engagement für die Menschenrechte und für die Aufklärung.
לחילונים זה מיותר, כואב, הטלת מום, כל השיקולים, אין סיבה לעשות. בקיצור, בוא נעשה שורה תחתונה.
יש לך בנים?
בטח, יש לי בן 17 וגם בנות, ולא עשיתי לו ברית מילה. הילד יהודי, אמא שלו יהודייה, הילד יהודי, הלב שלנו יהודי, זאת אומרת, יהודי זה מי שמרגיש יהודי, לא מי שחתכו לו.
Today there are a lot of intact boys and men in Israel that are without breath, and they are Jewish the same as everybody.
God Almighty, I mean, no, you are not Jewish because you have or don't have a foreskin. Remember, the circumcision does not in any way affect someone's Jewishness.
Really, religion is in our actions. It's in our ethics, in our responsibility, in our compassion. Removing genital tissue from my son doesn't make him a good human being.